Welcome, everyone, here in the Del Mar Center Hall, those on Zoom, and later on YouTube. My name is Linda McCabe. I am the chair of the Sea Ranch Forum. And as always, we start with safety first. In case you need to leave, the doors with exit on them is where you leave. If anyone needs to use the restroom, they are not in this building. They are across the sidewalk and to another room, another building over there. And may we never need them, but there are AEDs on the wall back there, okay? And as a reminder, even for myself, this is a perfect time to shut off your phones so they don't ring and have various ringtones going on, and turn them to what my husband calls the cheap thrill mode. Thank you. So for those who are unfamiliar with the Sea Ranch Forum, we have a rich history that started 51 years ago in August 1973. We are a group of sea ranchers who puts on these meetings, and we are not an official committee, so we are independent of the community manager and of the board of directors. We do not report to either the board of directors or to staff, and they do not direct us on the content of our meetings. And the Sea Ranch Foundation has a tradition of never raising money or spending money. That's why the website that I created is a freebie. So the recent Board of Directors strategy meeting held in June included finishing the airport rules as being on their to-do list. But there was no discussion of what that entailed. It took 18 months for that regular process of the association to play out, for the recent rules changes to be discussed, debated, and adopted. There was criticism that the subject took too much time in meetings and took away time from other agenda items being discussed. So we thought it would be beneficial to spend time in a forum setting to discuss these issues in depth and to provide a context of the history of our local airports, then move to the safety concerns and reasons behind those recent rules changes, and to discuss what unfinished business remains. I want to introduce our speakers. Julie Bauer is the manager of the Ocean Ridge Airport. Gina Hubbell is a director on the Sea Ranch Board of Directors. Marcus Lavinson is a retired professional pilot with 36 years of a broad range of experience. Scott Nevin is a former director on the Sea Ranch Board of Directors and was the driving force behind the recent rules changes. I would also like to personally thank Linda Kennedy and the Sea Ranch Archives Committee for helping to provide us with historic images and information about the history of the Sea Ranch airstrips. And one other thing is to please hold your questions until after the panel has made their presentations, and then we'll open the floor to questions from those in the Del Mar Center Hall and on Zoom. Thank you.
So I'm Julie Bauer. I'm Julie Bauer. I've lived in Wallala for about 11 years, been coming to the coast my entire life. My family, my mom's family, was from Manchester and Point Arena. They were Hallidays. I married into the Bauer family, and now I live up here. I do not live at the airport in Wallala. That is still my father-in-law's home. It's where my husband was born and raised, right on the airstrip. But I live downtown, and I'm at the airport daily for various things, including keeping an eye over the airport operations. Our family did not build this airport. It was originally built by the Segerstrom family, which I believe were in like silver mining down in Nevada and Southern California. My father-in-law's father, John Sr., purchased the airport at auction and the surrounding timberland and allowed his son to live there and to manage it. Originally, I found in some newspaper archives, the intention of this airport and what is now Bauer Park was for a fly-in golf resort. Before the Sea Ranch was the Sea Ranch that we know today, And the reason it didn't really get off the ground was because there was not enough water. There was North Wallala Water Company, the municipal water supply for Wallala, but it didn't actually go up to the ridge at that time. And there were wells, and they just didn't have enough water in them for the summer months to keep the greens green for the golf course. So eventually, I believe the Segerstroms just sort of abandoned the idea, and my father-in-law's father acquired all the property. This runway was, if any of you ever were up there pre-storms of 2023, you would see it was very alligatoring and cracking the asphalt surface. It was not a properly paved surface. It was like river run material, probably gotten from the Wallala River, and probably only an inch or two thick, and then just with slurry seal on top. So it was asphalt material, but it was not a properly paved runway, and we had a lot of issues with it deteriorating over time, and it took a lot of maintenance. So this is a postcard that I found in our archives from the 1970s. Our slogan back then was above the fog and beyond the smog, which is still largely true. I know we get a lot of Sea Ranch folks landing where we are and then scurrying down to get their car at their house and then eventually shuttling their airplane back to the Sea Ranch airport when it's socked in. We do get a lot of CalStar and Reach medical evacuations when other areas are socked in with fog. So this photograph, you can see what the airport looks like. You see that there are not hangars on the east side. There, and you can barely see there were some structures on the west side, including the caretaker's home. And this is just an NTSB record showing, I think this is, yeah, from 1964. And you can just see that there were deer on the runway, a deer crossed the runway, and there was some sort of incident. That still happens, of course. Our airport is, like I said, my family lives there, has always lived there since the 70s. It's also commercial, and I guess technically it's industrial and heavy industrial. It is the only heavy industrial zoned area in all of Wallala. And if you're ever up there, you'll notice backhoes, bulldozers, things traversing the property. And we have mini storage on site. We also have an industrial building, and we have numerous hangars with pilot and regular storage tenants. So there are things that cross our runway. So we eventually became Ocean Ridge Airport. And the land that was going to be for the golf course itself across the street on Old Stage Road, which at the time was called Brushy Opening Road, the family donated about 10 acres in the 80s to become a park. And so the pond at the park was part of the golf course development originally, and I believe there's a pond on some other private properties that were subdivided out later. So we have many hangar buildings. We offer tie downs nightly, outdoors, and like I said, we have a mini storage unit and the industrial building. Those two buildings are on the west side of the runway, so people using those do not have to cross our runway. But we do have people, including our employees, that need to cross the runway. So if you ever come to the airport, there are yellow and black painted lines on the ground, and that is the holding position line. You're to stop. And I've taught my children and everybody else, you stop, you look, and you listen up and down. It's not like crossing a road. You have to pay attention to what's going on around you because our runway is humped and you cannot see one end to the other. So it's a little precarious. It's not an airport for beginners. The CalStar and Reach helicopters land, as you know, they'll do whatever they need to do in the best interest of the patients and their safety. They typically land, they touch down right near the house. So it gets very loud when we have helicopters landing there, but we're happy to accommodate that. So in January of 2023, we had that cyclone, that bomb cyclone event, and we all remember what that looked like. Thousands of trees down, insane winds. It tore some of our hangar doors apart, just literally just peeled them apart in all of that wind. And I was contacted a couple of days, maybe a day or so into that event by PG&E asking if they could rent our property and use it as a base camp. Initially, actually, what they asked me for was if they could just store some trucks and maybe some power poles. And I, of course, it didn't matter what they asked. The answer would be yes. We're here to serve. We're a public use airport, but we're privately owned and we maintain it for things exactly like this, as well as for our pilot community. The airport has been used in smaller capacities before by CDF, the Sheriff's Department, going out on drug raids, that kind of thing. It's never been used to this extent. So the PG&E land acquisition folks came out and took a look, and I initially had just given them a screenshot of Google Earth and circled some paved areas and said, well, you can use these areas and you cannot use the runway because it's just a little bit of gravel with the smallest amount of asphalt material on top. It really can't stand up to large equipment, and certainly not after all of that rain that we had. Everything was saturated. The water table was right up on the surface of the soil. So they came out and they have their advanced weather predicting capabilities, and they knew how big this was going to continue to be for a few days. And so they understood the impacts that it would have, not just around here, but the entire region, far inland, the east. And so the impacts to their power grid were pretty substantial. So they said, well, we actually need to use the whole runway. We need to use the runway, the taxiway. We need to tuck in around all of your hangars, everything. So I said, it is not up to me. I have to go ask my father-in-law. This is his property. So I went and talked with John, and I will never forget, everything's dark. Power's out. It's been out for a couple days. It is storming outside, and he's got PG&E folks in their trucks idling in the driveway waiting for an answer. And I said, John, this is what we've always talked about. This is the reason you have always subsidized keeping the airport open. It does not pay for itself with our $7 a night tie down fees and our hangar rentals. We pay money into it all the time to keep it open and accessible. And he said, you're right. This is what I've been waiting for. I've always wanted to be available for emergencies. So we said yes. And we got PG&E to agree to repave the airport properly, the way it should have been done originally, to accommodate them coming back if they ever have to, because we will have disasters like this again, whether it's wildfires or tsunamis or whatever. So you can see here, this is looking from the south. This is our 3-1 approach, and you can see masses of trailers, all these identical trailers in a nice, neat rows down here. Those are the bunkhouses, the accommodations. I believe they said they had accommodations for something like 800 people, but with COVID, post-COVID restrictions, they could only have like half or a third of those folks there. But they had along the east side there, past the red trucks, you can see those were like recreation trailers for people to have some R&R after long days and nights out in the field. They had cafeterias. They had the most amazing 40-foot trailer full of washing machines and dryers. It was incredible. It was completely self-sufficient. They brought in all their own food, everything, lots of generators. They had a mobile hospital. And as you can imagine, our runway did not hold up. The whole surface just completely deteriorated. They did the best they could. You can see some mats down there, some like tan colored mats. They brought these big rubber mats in, and they knew they were going to damage the surface, but it was to give their personnel and their vehicles some more stability on that very soupy soil. And then down here is an image showing the 1-3 approach near the house. So that's the caretaker's house with a little backyard there. And there, right behind the backyard, you see the mobile hospital and various things like that. So they took over the whole entire airport. And so that was from the first week of January. And it did not reopen to us until I believe it was like the 3rd week of August. We were closed completely. We couldn't have any aircraft operations for over 8 months. It was a really long time, and our tenants were not thrilled because they wanted to be able to get their aircraft in and mostly out. We had to work with people, but by and large, people were very, very understanding. And now the runway is incredible. PG&E actually regraded it and had their contractors take down that hump. So it's about 2 feet lower in the center. So it's, I think, a bit safer. It's more flat, but you still can't see one end to the other. And in the meantime, PG&E has come back and used the airport again, but this time they did only store 1 truck and one power pole. But we're there if they ever need them. That's our airport. Privately owned, public use, happy to help however we can.
I'm Gina Hubbell. Um, Is this better? Okay. I'm going to talk about the history of the Sea Ranch airstrip. And I'm going to give a summary of it and how it has been operating since its beginnings very early on. And I think it's interesting, and I'm not sure everyone understands this, but the airstrip is one of the most defining aspects of the Sea Ranch. I compared it, we've been doing a lot of work on the hedgerows, and it was here before effectively the Sea Ranch was here. And like the hedgerows, it was here primarily for a commercial purpose. In the case of the hedgerows, it was to create meadows for the sheep and windbreaks. In the case of the airstrip, it was to bring people up primarily to buy property at the Sea Ranch. So it is very interesting when we think about it that it has been here again, and in fact, before the Sea Ranch. And as Linda said, the airstrip has been a topic of discussion for quite a while now. And I think understanding the evolution of the airstrip helps to put that discussion in context and may help us in finding sort of a meeting of the minds of, how to go forward with it. In the first section, we'll talk about the conceptual ideas of the airstrip and how those early concepts translated to how it was constructed and where it was constructed to get a sense of the purpose and characteristics that have shaped how it is used and regulated through to the present. Here's a very early drawing of Halprin's. And this shows, you can see here, the airstrip. And I think there are a couple of noteworthy items. First of all, if you can see this, but it says the runway would be 3,000 feet, whereas in fact it's 2,600 feet. The references to airport versus airstrip, which has been sort of going back and forth on that. And then no houses are indicated, at least here, to be built near the airstrip. The closest houses, if you can see, were the condominiums here on the east side of Highway 1. But this is from 1964, so as I said earlier, before the Sea Ranch. Here is a picture of the runway in 1966, and you can see Highway 1 almost to the edge there on the upper left. And I think it's always amazing to see the topography of the Sea Ranch landscape in the beginning versus today. As an aside, when Halprin and Boki came here, the wind effect of the no trees was so strong, they said, oh, we have to plant some trees. And according to Halprin, at least, they planted over 1 million trees, really because they thought 1 out of 5 would survive, when in fact 100% survived. So the Sea Ranch became, obviously, from a landscape perspective, very different. But here it is effectively denuded of any of the trees that we know today. There's also, even though it sort of doesn't look like it, there are 2 runways which continue today. There's runway 30 and there's runway 12. There are 3 airplanes parked on the tarmac, and there are no hangars at that time. Here's an aerial shot sometime later, and you can see the development of the Sea Ranch. There's more homes, still no homes close to the airstrip, and growth closer to the west side of the airstrip, and the fire station and the association offices that you see. There's 1 home. I mean, it's kind of hard to see in the trees, but that's on Sea Ridge, which is one of the streets that's very close. And there are twice as many planes parked. 6, as I could count them. This next slide is what they call the cumulative suggestion master plan. This shows a more detailed rendering of the airstrip and the surrounding area. It indicates the parking and the airfield. And it also shows, interestingly, churches being built somewhat near. Not sure why. And then the next slide is, again, a picture that actually went with the pilot conduct rules. And one of the first things you see here is you have to turn left when you take off at 190 degrees until you reach the coastline. Then I think there appear to be 2 windsocks. Do you agree with that, Marcus? There used to be, but there is now only 1 windsock. So this is, again, a rendering. Now, this, of course, shows the 2,600 feet. This is a revised picture in 1989. And this is interesting because I think this is a land use study. This is actually what gets filed with Sonoma to define the ownership properties of the Sea Ranch, including, as an association, the commons, the individual homeowner lots. And so this is what you would see if you went to the records and looked at this portion of the plot of the Sea Ranch. This really is designed to show a change in the airstrip approach zones. The original was based on California rules. The red, which is the wider, is based on FAA rules as adopted by California. And sort of finally, this is consistent with the composition of the homes and the location and the airstrip today. Still calling it an airport in 1981. I think one of the interesting things is one of the reasons that I think you see this evolution of the homes coming closer to the airstrip is when the Bain Bill, some of the restrictions of the Bain Bill for economic reasons made the owners of Oceanic have to think about more lots in places where they hadn't considered them to be before. And I think that's in part why you see by this time a different configuration and layout of the lots. I think, as you were saying, there's no weather station at Ocean Ridge?
Ridge does have it.
Does have one. Well, in 2002, the FAA and the National Weather Services consolidated the Ukiah Weather Station, and so there was one available. So that was purchased with the idea that it would be installed at the Sea Ranch airstrip so that you could get wind direction, you could get visibility information by phone to make it easier for pilots to know what the weather conditions were at the Sea Ranch when they might want to come in, to the airstrip. And it was a good idea whether or not it happened. So this next thing section is why. Why did we basically need the airport? And as I said earlier, there's some really basic reasons related to the development of the Sea Ranch itself. So aerial views of the topography for planning the layout, transporting potential purchasers to the area. Alboki was a pilot and commuted to the Sea Ranch for work, and also obviously a recreational facility for pilot sea ranchers. And so, all right, this is an interesting quote from Boki. I think it gives a little of a context of what some of the thinking was around it. And basically he says the intent was to build a landing strip with tie downs, a landing field, not with buildings, but just tie downs. So the idea of a simple, very basic place where you could land without a lot of frills, without a lot of things that you think about being at an airport. And then, of course, with some controversy, people wanted to build hangars. And this is a blueprint for the hangars. Don Jacobs was the architect, and actually Halpern said in one of his writings in 1983 that they were considered some of the most beautiful buildings at the Sea Ranch and most consistent with the idea of living lightly on the land or blending into the landscape. So they actually are important architecturally in the history of the Sea Ranch, and they are privately owned. This is an advertisement for the airstrip, again, trying to entice people to come here for this, in this case, this recreational facility that they could do and only make have an hour distant, only take you an hour to get up to the Sea Ranch. It did promise fueling facilities and lights, which never came to pass, as with many real estate promises. But I think it's kind of interesting that it actually was in the newspaper to encourage people to buy property. And again, another thing to try to attract people were these pilot purchasers spot landing rodeos that were every weekend on Saturday and Sunday from 1966 to 1967. And they were co-sponsored by the Northern California Piper dealers. And I think they make aircraft, right? And then, you got various prizes, cash. You had a weekend at the Sea Ranch, different things. And the pilots will understand what this means better. I wasn't quite sure what a horse rodeo versus an airplane rodeo was, but apparently they were really well attended too. All right, now we're moving to our favorite subject, some rules and regulations. And again, this is really to show that the Sea Ranches always had, parameters within which people are supposed to operate when using the airstrip, and that they have evolved over time to deal with changes in many respects, including the demographics of the Sea Ranch. So here, this is trying to go in a chronological order so that it gives a historical sense of it, and you can see how it has been changing. This letter is from the chair of actually there was an aviation committee at the time, and the stress really was respecting individual rights and safety for everyone, pilots, passengers, and people on the ground. So this was put with the rules of conduct that are the rules that pilots were supposed to follow when they were using the airstrip. And again, some of the ones that certainly have continued today are listed on the right-hand side. The first one being a VFR, private restricted, which for, me simplistically is that you have to be able to see a mile in front of you if you want to take off. It's not instrument, so that was an early designation. This was in 1975. And again, we've thought about the restrictions on the type of aircraft that you could use the airstrip, and they actually had restrictions at that time. I'm not sure what definitionally a biz jet is. But they were precluded DC-3s and certain twin engines. So if you had planes in those categories, you couldn't land at the airstrip. It did require registration and prohibited buzzing, which is, dipping your wing or whatever near a home or something. And there was a phone booth. And this is just a snapshot of the current airport permit. Marcus is going to go into much more detail on that. And it replaced the original permit that was in 1966. And I think just it listed a special use permit, meaning that this is a private airstrip. It's not public. As such, it's not directly regulated by the FAA. It's regulated by Caltrans, but certainly pilots have to follow FAA standards, and Caltrans, follows a lot of that as well. Now I find this very interesting. Here's a notice in the bulletin that in 1991, where again, the chair of the aviation committee talks about the rules and updates them for people. There's somewhat strong language here, but it's illegal to land without having received the rules. The references buzzards circling about that you need to know about, and that enforcement was very successful. If you violated a rule, you probably wouldn't do it a second time. And part of that was because they would boot the plane if you violated, And I'm not sure they ever did this one, but they would require the plane owner to disassemble the plane and then reassemble it at a different airport. Now, I have never heard that that happened, but I could see why it would be a huge deterrent. It's stress safe flying because that really is, again, a fundamental aspect of the rules. He said that some of the best ideas have come from non-pilots and I don't know why I put this in, but announced intentions on frequency 122.9, which I'm not sure has a lot of relevance. But you can see this language here about how being illegal to land without receiving the briefing. Now, we can go, this is Rule 5.0, which has basically been superseded by Rule 7.2, which was adopted in 2023-24. And it basically, again, shows things that we've been talking about. You can't do landing practice. You can't fly low. Here, violations are to be reported to the FAA and Sea Ranch Security. So again, you see some of the similar things that we've been looking at today at that time, and even sort of enhanced in terms of the reporting. I don't think we have the FAA reporting. Do we, as a requirement? And here what I tried to do is take each of the different pilot briefings, starting in 1991, then 1995, and 2003, and highlight provisions in them, and then each of the subsequent ones has what was added from the prior one. So 1991, again, shows some of the things, again, we've talked about: left turn, prior permission, there's no weather info, you have to have a valid ID hang tag. Then you get to 1995, no operations after dark. There's a start to think about noise abatement, so there's no touch and goes or practice landings, and there's an indication of the hump in the middle of the runway. If you can't comply, please land elsewhere. That's in the 2003 briefing. There's no straight-ins. Again, mentions buzzards, now has added turkeys and deer. And for noise abatement, that's part of the reason for turning left to 190 to the coastline. So now we look at the current one, and looking at highlights there is, operation in visual meteorological conditions, which in VMC, which I talked about earlier, no aircraft over the takeoff with a takeoff weight over 8,500 pounds, subject to certain exceptions, an accelerate stop distance of less than 2,300 feet, even though the runway is 2,600 feet. Noise sensitivity adding to that, so select airspeeds, power settings, and bank angles to mitigate noise. Ground run times less than 5 minutes, again, primarily for noise, and now no reference to buzzards. I don't know if they went away. And then there's, in the current one, which I think is more detailed and sort of easier to understand, in, at least in layperson's terms, this goes with the briefing and shows the measurement first for runway 12 and distances, and then for runway 30 shows. And you can see that mile, 1.01 mile, and that hill, and that's basically for the visibility purposes. You have to see that in order to comply with the VMC requirements. Okay, now finally coming to a few sort of things going way back in time. There are, and you can get these in big if you want to see anything. I have the full things, but just to highlight the crashes, which are in 1969, 73, 2004, 2010, and most recently last year, due to, if you see them, bad landings, a conked out engine, a too low approach, a too fast approach. The plane on at the bottom of the cliff was the one who flew in too low and couldn't meet the, lower than the ground. Everyone walked away, so there were no fatalities or even real injuries in these instances. but it's kind of interesting. The one in the lower left was blown off the runway by a gust of wind. So, shows sort of, various weather conditions as well as, operating errors that cause that. These are some, what I was calling more like anecdotes. In the upper left-hand corner, there is a plane carved from blocks of styrofoam and polyethylene foam and covered by layers of fiberglass and epoxy resin that ran on a standard engine and which had a cruising speed of 180 miles an hour, and it landed at the Sea Ranch. I think this would have passed the weight limitation, but it does sound a little like the Titan. Another incident was a plane landing at what was called by the ICO the Sea Ranch Meadows International Airport, where they landed between Land's End and Breakers Reach in 1973 due to fog, making it impossible to see where the airstrip was. And the pilot and the passenger just tied down and went to the lodge for dinner in a room. So pretty, in another article, just going back to Ocean Ridge, when funds were being raised for the airport, Sea Ranch pilots stressed how important it was to have that additional airport, in part because due to its higher elevation, you could use it more frequently than the Sea Ranch airstrip that was at a much lower altitude, I think 1,000 feet, and we're at 350, 336. So just actually moving to that, comparing the two airports, you can see here various characteristics. As I just said, one is at Ocean Ridge is at 360, excuse me, Sea Ranch is at 360, and the Ocean Ridge is at 1,000. Ocean Ridge is open to the public, the Sea Ranch is not. These are highlighted in this slide. Again, you can see differences, some differences in runway length, the prohibitions on the type of aircraft, public versus private. So you can get an idea of how you could use one airstrip versus the other. And this is where this crosses, the circles crosses, the similarities are the same things, no touch and go landings, nothing after sunset and before sunrise, no lighting, no instrument procedures. And now, I hope this gave you a sense of the evolution of the airstrip and why it was constructed, how it was regulated, and how we are thinking about it going forward. It is an iconic element of the Sea Ranch, and we must preserve it while meeting changing conditions. It should be for the enjoyment of all of us. And I now turn over the discussion to our resident expert, Marcus Levinson, who will give a much more detailed and accurate explanation of the rules and the thinking behind them. Just to give a summary, Marcus has been a professional pilot for 36 years and has obtained the highest rating level of airline transport, qualified both visual and instrument for both fixed and rotary wing aircraft. He has over 13,000 hours in the air, was an air medical helicopter pilot, is an author, and was an IFR procedures expert for multiple hospitals, and flew to oil rigs. So anyway, thank you. Lots of stuff. Oh, supposed to hand it.
Is the mic close enough, do you think? Okay, how about that? My outside voice, so I'll try. Okay, everybody hear me okay? Good. Okay, so we'll start off. I'm just going to run through some rules, regulations, and the important to me thing about having our own airport is how to mitigate risk and be as safe as possible. Out of all the facilities we have at Sea Ranch, the airport has the potential of one event resulting in multiple fatalities, and that's why it matters to every member at Sea Ranch. not just pilots, but everybody. Okay. And we made a lot of improvements the last 3 years, in no small part due to John Prescott, who we lost recently. He was our facilities director. And as we're going to go over in the next few slides, we were out of compliant and deficient on a lot of aspects at the airport that increased the risk unnecessarily. And we are almost fully compliant. We've just got one more runway marking that I'll show you that we need to fix. But John got it done. So I will always be thankful for that. Okay, so in the last 3 years, runway hold short lines at both taxiways, they were missing. That's now been rectified. That was required, and they weren't there. And what that is, it's surface markings, and that alerts the pilot that, hey, I'm about ready to leave a taxiway and actually taxi onto a runway. And there are certain things a pilot would do, radio, look both ways, before you like what Julie talked about, before you just barrel out on a runway. And let's see. Okay, and then the runway identifier signs associated with those surface markings, those were also missing. And so those are now installed, and they're the proper signs in accordance with FAA, and they're in the right position, they're the right distance. When you get into the FAA, there's not a lot of guesswork. So you'll have documents that tell you how high the sign should be, how far it should be from the edge of the pavement, the font, the color. And so we're now fully compliant on that. This one, red coming up, this is the one thing we still need to correct, and that's supposed to be corrected. That should be corrected in just a month or two. So the displaced threshold is incorrectly marked on the runway, and that unfortunately signifies to the pilot that that runway is 100 feet or wider. It's not, it's 40 feet. And it should be correctly marked, and we're going to fix that. There were some signs that were too close to the pavement, and you always think you can't, there's different types of airplanes. Some are low wing, some are high wing. So there's a reason why the height and distance of these signs is important. So that got corrected. And that another sign got corrected. It was in the wrong position. And John also replaced all the aircraft tie downs. We had a lot of tie downs that were rotted and missing. So that was pretty low hanging fruit, and that got corrected. And fence damage, a lot of loose boards presenting hazards to aircraft. We don't just have airplanes landing there, but we've got air medical helicopters landing on that ramp. And they typically can kick up a fair amount of rotor wash. And depending on how heavy they are, it can be up to 50 miles an hour. So you just don't want loose debris anywhere around an airport. So we call it FOD, and that would be foreign object damage. And so you would want to avoid that. One thing we're in the process of correcting is the current TPA means traffic pattern altitude. So right now it's at 800 feet in our airport permit and in our pilot briefing document, but it really should be 1,000 feet. That should help with noise. In 2018, what the FAA did was standardize all airports to be 1,000 feet for single engine piston and 1,500 for turboprop. And we are in the process of doing that. We're in a 4-month process of correcting the proper FAA form to correct that traffic pattern altitude to 1,000. It won't make much difference to a pilot in that they can still descend whenever they feel they need to in order to land, but it does standardize us in accordance with FAA and other airports. Okay, this slide shows you all the variances we have at Sea Ranch. Sea Ranch is absolutely not your average run-of-the-mill airport. It would never qualify to become a public airport. And there are 6 variances we have that don't meet standards. So you can, the one we already talked about is the runway not being wide enough. It's a pretty narrow runway. And the safety areas and obstructions and obstacles, they're too close. They don't meet design criteria. When we look at the airport permit by Caltrans, it specifies that we need to comply with FAA Airport Design AC Circular. It's 434 pages long. It's a doozy, but it's very technical and it's very precise. And because our airport doesn't meet all that criteria, we have these variances in the permit. So risk mitigation, as Gina spoke about, the Sea Ranch Board of Directors, they adopted some important airport rules this last winter. And they've limited, the big one is the VMC rule. And that's they've limited takeoffs and landings to where the pilot is required to have at least 1 mile visibility to reduce accidents caused by bad weather. So this is general aviation, what we have here at Sea Ranch. And 27% of all general aviation accidents are due to weather. The other thing they did was they limited the aircraft weight to 8,500 pounds. And we always had the accelerate stop distance, and that of 2,300 feet. That does not apply to all aircraft. So that's typically multi-engine aircraft, but the PC-12, I think everyone's probably familiar with the Pilatus PC-12. That's an outlier. It's Swiss, it's European, so they've got European regulations. So that's kind of an oddball aircraft in that it's single engine, but it does have a published accelerate stop distance. So that aircraft would have to comply with the accelerate stop distance. Okay, let me catch up a bit. Just some stats. As we talked about, 27% of general aviation accidents are weather related. 8% of general aviation accidents result in a fire. It's really not that common. The fatality rate for general aviation is 10 times higher than commercial, okay? So it's common, you'll often hear in newspapers and articles that aviation is safer than driving. That's not true with general aviation. It's 19 times more dangerous than driving, which is actually the same as riding a motorcycle, as it turns out. So it's a pretty good study, and everything we're covering is reference-based, and upon request, I have those references. Pardon? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, thank you. This is NTSB data. So that's National Transportation Safety Board, and they're over the FAA. So FAA is kind of a sub of that. Thanks. You're going to hear a few acronyms as we go through: IFR, VFR, IMC, VMC, and I just wanted to make it easy, and I think the best way is think of V as visual, great weather. Think of I as not so good weather, instruments. And that's where the pilot cannot see out of the windshield, or very far anyway, but he's flying in reduced visibilities, flying in clouds, and you need to have the proper instrumentation of the aircraft. Not only does the pilot have to be instrument rated and current, but the aircraft has to be an instrument capable aircraft. So it's really easy if you just think V, I can see, I can't see so good. Probably the simplest way to think of that. And it is. Well, yeah, we'll get to that, but yes. So this is a picture. This is runway 30. And remember how we talked about the 6, the variances we had to get in the airport permit in order to get our airport permitted by Caltrans? This is what we're talking about. If you look at this runway 30, so this is going northwest, and you'll see that ridge line. That ridge line is only a half a mile from the end of the runway, and it's much higher than the airport. Nobody in their right mind would design an airport this way, but it can be done safely. And that's why we got the variance and we got the permit. And you can see IMC, instrument, bad weather. The picture to the right shows, you can't even, the angle's wrong, but you couldn't even see the end of the runway. And the runway's a half a mile long. So that's reduced visibility, probably about a half a mile visibility. So this is the rule that the board passed this last winter. And VMC for our airspace that Sea Ranch Airport is in is 1 mile visibility, and the pilot stays clear of clouds. So if you have 1 mile visibility and you don't fly in a cloud, then you are VMC, you're fine. You're legal FAA for VFR flight in our airspace, and you're complying with the Sea Ranch rule that was recently passed. Okay, this is another slide. This is what IMC looks like. And this is at Sea Ranch Airport. It's a great question. The pilot actually does not take off. Fortunately, they aborted, they were loaded with passengers, but they aborted the flight partway down the runway and they taxied back to the ramp. So this is not an actual takeoff. Never spoke to the pilot, don't know what the intention was. I would hope they had an IFR flight plan, but I don't know that. Yeah. And we're talking about IFR, and Sea Ranch does not have any IFR procedures. So an aircraft to go from, obviously, if you're flying in the air, you want to get visual and land on a runway eventually if you're in an airplane. And if you're in the clouds, you do this flying an instrument approach procedure. And if you want to depart, you're on the ground, visual, you can see the runway, but you want to go in the clouds, typically you fly a departure procedure. Those are both instrument procedures. We don't have that at Sea Ranch. There is no departure procedure. And we'll in the next couple slides, we'll talk about what the FAA thinks about that. But this is Little River Airport that's not too far from us, and they do have a departure procedure. What's great about the procedure is the pilot can navigate this, its course, its altitude, its climb gradient. If you comply with that procedure, you are safely avoiding terrain and obstacles. It's a wonderful system, and it's a great way to fly. And actually, there's nothing safer than IFR flight in all of aviation. But the problem that we'll see later is when you talk about general aviation, the opposite's true. Okay, so
You might want to point out, if you go back to that slide, Marcus,
let's see, can I do that?
the 300 and the minimum 301.
Yeah,
You
thank you.
might want to point out what that means.
Sure. Okay, so this is actually an IFR departure procedure, and it has a weather minimum associated with it, and it's 301. A pilot that's going to use this procedure has to have at least a 300-foot ceiling and 1 mile visibility. That's a higher minimum than we have at Sea Ranch, and we don't even have a procedure. So that's, if we did have a departure procedure here, we would probably have a minimum more akin to that. So let's go into why we should not allow IMC instrument departures at this airport. Well, our airport permits stipulates compliance with the FAA circular that I talked about earlier. It's 434 pages. And that, let's see. And when you delve into that, that permit does not provide a variance for a 4 That's a ratio, 40 to 1. It's about like 1.25%. So it's not a big slope, but that's penetrated by terrain and obstacles, and we do not have a variance for that. And according to the airport design, FAA, that's required for instrument departures. And so it falls under the FAA, they call it recommended practices. So if the recommended practice, it gets a little technical, but for recommended practices, if a runway is visual without a published instrument departure procedure, you're supposed to comply with the 40 to 1. We don't have a variance for it. And we probably never could get a variance for it, because if you look down each runway, you're going to see high terrain right in front of you just a half a mile away. Probably not a great idea. So there can be valid reasons for an airport operator to not protect the visual runway, but that's for development like buildings and businesses. We don't have that. We actually have what we would call cumulogranite, the ground, and you never want to hit that as a pilot. And so IFR really is about two things. If you can control the aircraft and you can comply with IFR procedures, you get to live. And if you fail any one of those, you probably don't. So the next slide, the FAA goes a step further. So the FAA provides us regulations, but they also provide us guidance, and they provide us legal interpretations, and there's instrument procedure manuals. There's a lot that could fill up the table. And when you're a professional pilot doing it for a living, you really delve into all those things. And so what I did, I wrote the Office of General Aviation Safety Assurance. There was some different opinions on whether or not it was safe and legal to depart an IMC from Sea Ranch. I didn't think it was. So I wrote the FAA Office General Aviation Safety Assurance, and I got a letter back from them, and it's comprehensive, and they have several quote unquote potential concerns for legality and safety, considering the scenario of a pilot entering IMC conditions at Sea Ranch Airport. They go on to list 5 different FAA regulations that the pilot may be violating. So pretty significant. And to go further, if a pilot does get an IFR clearance, there's nothing wrong with a pilot. Let me interject. There's nothing wrong with a pilot departing IFR from Sea Ranch Airport. It's really all about what's the weather condition at the time they're departing, okay? So think 0-0. You can't even see 5 feet in front of the prop. Okay, that's pretty extreme. I think everybody would probably agree, not so great. Okay, don't depart IFR. Just stay on the ground. It's not a horrible place to be. We have an adage in aviation. There's nothing worse than being in the air really wishing you were on the ground. And if you fly long enough, you probably get those moments, and they're not fun, and it's not pleasant. So, and then take the example where a pilot files IFR to leave Sea Ranch, but the weather's good. It could be like right now, severe clear, blue skies, no clouds. Maybe they're going IFR because they're going to an airport that has weather conditions, or they just want to file IFR. It's a great way to go into San Francisco and places like that. You get sequenced better. So there could be reasons. It's all about the weather. Okay, so I just want to go back. When you do get an IFR clearance out of Sea Ranch, that pilot is required to maintain their own terrain and obstacle clearance. It's a big thing. So what does that, until reaching a minimum IFR altitude, what exactly does that mean? What does it mean to maintain your own terrain and obstacle clearance? Well, if you look in the FAA regulations, no definition. Look glossary, no definition. You look in the Airman Information Manual, no definition. You will only find it in one place. The FAA Legal Counsel did an interpretation in 2015. The only document they have. And by the way, those legal interpretations by the FAA Legal Counsel, they are regulatory and they are just as binding as the regulations. So as pilots, that's part of our study. We actually have to go to that website and look at those things once in a while, and we've got to know those as well. And how the FAA defines terrain and obstacle clearance, is visually. And here's part of it. So that pilot, until reaching a minimum IFR altitude, which over the ocean would be 1,000, and over land, it gets more technical depending on your routing, but it would be higher than that. That pilot is supposed to maintain visual contact. That's your eye. It's not using instrument, not head down in the cockpit, but it's your eye. You can see the ground and obstacles. It's see and avoid. And whether one likes that definition or not, it's the only definition they provide. So we're stuck with that. Okay, we're winding it up, but just a few stats here that are, I thought, kind of interesting is you'll often hear that IFR is safer than VFR, and we should be doing everything we can to encourage IFR at Sea Ranch. That's true if you take aviation as a whole. That's airlines, that's commercial, it's charter, and it's private pilots. It's general aviation too. But if you separate that, if you separate it and just count general aviation, the stats are actually very different. So let's look at that. First of all, 64% of all general aviation accidents in IMC, remember the I, bad weather, they have a fatality, whereas 18% in VFR, VMC, good weather, has a fatality. It kind of makes sense. If things go wrong and you're in the cloud and you can't see the ground, things are really going to go wrong. At least if the pilot can see the ground and see obstacles and see out of that windshield, that's a much better fighting chance. I've flown for 36 years, and if I'm going to have an in-flight emergency of any kind, I would rather be VFR than IFR. Absolutely. Great question. Yes, it is. Some of it is. And we're going to separate it in the next slide. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. But I'm not done, but I will. Yep. Well, yeah, we're getting there. Yeah, we're getting there. So, okay, so what we did, then we looked at NTSB data. There was a study that 16% of general aviation accidents with fatalities while departing IFR, which is what we're talking about at Sea Ranch. So there were 16 accidents with fatalities, and only one was noted by the FAA to be on a departure procedure. And we don't have a departure procedure here. So good reason not to allow that. So the fatality rate, we've seen that, it's higher. It's much higher than if that aircraft is VMC. The accident rate for general aviation is higher for IFR pilots than VFR pilots. There was a study at Embry-Riddle University that looked at that, and we've got that reference as well. So a prevailing cause in NTSB IFR accident reports, the prevailing cause of IFR accidents, NTSB reports, is poor pilot judgment and improper IFR procedures. So if you do IFR correctly, it's very safe. Incorrectly, it's very forgiving. Unforgiving, sorry.
Question, is that is that those 16 fatalities from IFR departure accidents, is that nationally, California, what?
No, that's national. That's not Alaska, it's continental United States.
Okay.
Lower 48. And it's actually it's more than 16 fatalities, it's 16 accidents with fatalities. Yeah. And so there was, yeah. So to the IMC, what happens now is the NTSB does not have data they don't have the data to determine. They just know the aircraft was an IMC, but they don't have the data out of that 64% to know how many of those aircraft were IFR on an IFR clearance and how many were VMC going inadvertently IMC. So, but the bottom part, we do know that. So we do know that there's general aviation has had 16 fatalities. And that's not all the accidents IFR, that's just the ones that were on departures. And only one was flying a departure procedure. So the FAA also, let me go back, they recommend in the Instrument Procedures Handbook for Pilots, they recommend that all pilots, even general aviation pilots, adhere to commercial departure minimums. They're not technically required to, but the FAA strongly advises it, and that's actually in a manual. So not a bad idea. And that's just the last slide, why it matters to all members. And we all have a vested interest in the safety of our airport.
I have my own. I have my own. Before I start, I really want to thank Julie Bauer and the Bauer family for what they did when the storms hit here. I know I attempted to open up our airport for the Gualala pilots and the community that use that airport, and we ran into some obstacles. And I realized what a sacrifice it was for them and that community to shut their airport down for 7 months. So you have my thanks. I'd also like to thank Marcus for all the time that he has put in this and the numerous telephone calls that we've had over the last several years in trying to make this come to fruition. He is a retired pilot, and I think the last thing that he wanted to do in retirement was work on aviation issues. But I appreciate his level-headedness and being able to work through the issues with him. So I guess I'm the anchor of this, and the question is well, why did the board take this up? Why did the board get involved in this? And it was a confluence of issues that kind of all came together roughly about 3 years ago. There were issues that were raised to the community manager and raised to the board. You can read, I'm not going to insult your intelligence. Some of these issues were purely operational. As Marcus pointed out, we had some deficiencies in terms of the runway environment, airport environment. I remember meeting Marcus and John Prescott out at the airport. We walked it, we looked at all the markings, we looked at the signage, and we just started ticking off a number of things that needed to be fixed. And John Prescott drove it all and managed to get it taken care of. The hold short lines, I think, were the big concern for Marcus and I, because you really, as a pilot, when you're flying an airplane, you really need to know where to hold short from that runway if there's another airplane operating on the runway environment, so that you're not encroaching on that and making them be uncomfortable. And we have a super narrow runway. A 40-foot runway is, it's a challenge to get down, especially in the winds that we have here. So since I was the sole member of the board that actually flew aircraft at one point in time, and seems like another lifetime ago, I taught aviation, this fell into my lap. And believe me, it was the last thing that I thought I would be working on as a board member when I ran for the board, but that's the life of a board member. You get to deal with issues as they come up. I really hadn't thought much about the airport rules up to that point in time. It was, yeah, I read through the rules and it was like, yep, rules. And then these issues came up and I was like, well, let's take a look at the rules. Does this really make sense for where we are right now, for what's happening at our airport, the increasing size of aircraft that are now starting to operate in and out of our little airstrip? And what really struck me was that it was of my opinion that our rules were fairly lax given the level of risk and liability surrounding the airport. as this kind of got traction within the board, there were a couple of issues that were raised by my fellow board members surrounding the insurance. Did we actually have the right insurance? Did we have the right level of insurance? And that's where we and in full disclosure, I was in the minority of wanting to bring an aviation attorney in. I thought it was going to complicate issues. But I was outvoted, and we did hire an attorney out of San Francisco, and he provided, I think, fairly good insight into what our risks and liabilities were, and he spent a lot of time researching our insurance and convinced the board that we have the right insurance and we have the right level of insurance. Then that started us down a rabbit hole on agreements and contracts to use the airport, which I think got a bit tangled up, which is one of the to-do items on the board's to-do list, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, process. Kind of funny that the board was criticized at the outset for the appearance of rushing forward to a decision on the airport. And then I think after 18 months of public meetings and board meetings and public comment, I think a lot of members started to complain that it was taking too long to get it done. So, it is what it is. I believe that the board followed a disciplined process. Issues were raised. The board agreed that the issues needed to be looked into. Having a policy component, we referred it to the planning committee. The planning committee held 2 public meetings for public comment, and they referred back to the board a set of directions and their advice. And again, that's advice. The board doesn't have to follow it, but we can use it in our deliberations. Again, we hired aviation counsel to advise us on the issues of liability and insurance coverage. We used our Davis Sterling attorney to basically review the rule changes to make sure that what we were doing was made, or at least made sense in the context of what HOAs can and can't do. And then over a series of many public meetings, we listened to the membership. I believe that the board made a number of changes in the implementation and the rules in response to comments that we got from the membership. The board ultimately voted 6-1 to modify the rules. And there was one no vote, and that was Director Alonso Martinez. And his vote was in protest, primarily because the rule changes he felt shouldn't have allowed a legacy status for aircraft over 8,500 pounds. I would have preferred to have a unanimous vote. However, I respect Manuel's opposition to it, and I respect him for it and respecting in the way he voted on it. So I'm not going to go through the whole timeline, but I'll just point out that this actually started well before June 2022, which seems like forever ago. There were the issues that had been brought up to the community manager and the board, and so we were trying to figure out what to do with it. Marcus had contacted the board, advising us of the operational issues that we had, but we finally got the ball rolling around June, and that's when I first brought the topic to the board and recommended that we kick it over to the planning committee. And I put together a presentation for the planning committee on potential things that we could do at the airport to try to mitigate some of the concerns and complaints that we were getting from members, and things that we could do to make the airport, I think, more in line with smaller airports, and not have what I would consider a fairly laissez-faire approach to running our airport, which the association and the membership own. Gosh, after several meetings of the planning committee, we finally engaged with a law group, and that began the wheels turning of the review of the insurance and liability issues, and then starting to feed that back into potentially what we could do. Our aviation attorney said that we were a private airport masquerading as a public airport, which was, those were his words. They kind of stuck with me. More meetings, more input from members, the wheels of progress slowly turning, sausage being made, rules being tweaked and reviewed by council. So now we're well into almost 18 months, 16 months, and finally 18 months later, we got the rules published. And we'll talk about what I think was significant in getting those rules passed in just a minute. If I had to put a guess in the number of hours that I put into this one single topic on the board, I think it's probably around 200 hours. But the board's not done yet. There are still a couple of housekeeping items that they need to address. So what changed? So up to that point, there were no fines listed in Rule 2.3, which is a schedule of fines for violating certain rules. And there were several board members that were concerned that given the risk and liability surrounding the airport, and that we wanted to encourage good behavior around the airport, that having the airport rule violations fall into the other violations bucket of $100 or a $200 or $300 violation probably didn't make a lot of sense. So that drove that change with some fairly significant dollar amounts. And I just want to point out, there are some notes in this. And, you know, I heard from at least one member that called our security staff the Gestapo. I believe that our security people are reasonable people. And other boards have believed that our security people are reasonable people. So note 1 says that compliance staff may exercise discretion and provide warning notices in lieu of fines based on the circumstances. And there is also another note, which is actually a really important note. It says, notwithstanding the fine schedule, the board may reduce a fine. So for those of you that don't understand how this works, is that when there is a noted violation, that it will go through staff, and staff will do the research, staff will document it, and then staff will make a recommendation to the board for this type of a fine, and it would come to the board, and then the board can make a decision on what to do with it. Well, I found the whole disassembling of an airplane and transporting it elsewhere to be interesting. However, I think if you consulted with our attorney, that they might say that exposed the association to a certain liability. All right, so that's 2.3. So getting to Rule 7.2. So the rule changes that I think were significant was, first off, we had a fairly bad actor with a helicopter that I just say that he didn't have a great appreciation for Sea Ranch members, and decided to have his pilot fly his helicopter in whatever way he wanted to. And that generated a large number of noise complaints. I tried to come up with a rule to limit the type of helicopters that would land at the airport, but after having numerous telephone conversations with Marcus, who understands the rotating wing part of aviation, I never step foot in a helicopter. I think those are dangerous. But he and I finally came to an agreement that would have been pretty difficult to implement. But the one thing that we did do was we asked that helicopter engine run times be kept to 5 minutes or less. And the exception in this, and the exception to all of the rules, is that first responders, Life Flight, CalStar, Caltrans, the sheriff, they are exempt from all the rules. We wanted to make sure that our first responders could operate in the manner that they felt necessary. A lot of times CalStar or Breach will keep their engines running because there is a person in dire need to get out of the airport as fast as possible. And so they will be getting them on board to transport them out. The other thing that I did was I looked at other smaller airports, and I haven't flown in 18-ish years. And I recall flying into really small airports in the state of Michigan where I learned how to fly. And I knew that a lot of these airports had weight restrictions. And I looked at our rules and was like, we have a 12,500 pound weight limit. And that is a very, very big airplane. And so I looked at other small airports in the Sonoma County area and Mendocino, and in the neighborhood of 8,000 to 8,500 pounds was, that seemed to be the norm. There was some argument, well, it should be 8,000 pounds, not 8,500 pounds. A 500-pound difference isn't going to make a world of difference in terms of the aircraft that fly in here. However, reducing it down from 12,500 to 8,500 certainly limits the type of aircraft that come in, and most notably the PC-12s. And so the board created some carve-outs to allow people that either owned a PC-12 or had ordered a PC-12 to be able to continue to operate that aircraft into the Sea Ranch Airport, and they had to be a member at the time. So it's a fairly fixed window of how long PC-12s will be flying into the Sea Ranch. I have a master's degree in aerospace engineering. The PC-12 is a highly capable aircraft. However, it's a really noisy aircraft. It's a really big aircraft, and I don't believe it has a place at the Sea Ranch in our tiny little airport. And if you do the math, the closest house is 4 wingspans away from the runway, 4 PC-12 wingspans. So that's where the board went on that. Just as a side note, I actually talked with the owner of AirSF, Bruce McLean, and had a telephone conversation with him after the board passed the rule. And it was interesting that he thanked me because he said, we don't really like flying into your airport. It's a tiny airport and it's really difficult for us. And the wheels in my head were turning. It's like, but you still did it. You still took people's money and flew them into an airport you didn't like flying into. Yeah, he did make the comment that he believed his insurance agent would be very happy that he wasn't flying into the Sea Ranch anymore. Now, whether he was making a joke or whether that was real, I don't really know. Then the rules, this is where when you get the lawyers involved, then the rules got very wonky. We added some legalese that was recommended by actually our Davis Sterling attorney. And primarily the takeaway is that stated right in the rules that when you use the airport, it's at the risk of the user and not the association. And then finally, I think that the most important rule adopted by the board was limiting the operations at the airport to VMC. Going back into the history, we've seen in the history documents that at one point in time it stipulated that only VFR flights could be made out of the airport. So people at that time that were flying thought about this. But as Marcus pointed out, there's a distinction between IFR and VFR and IMC and VMC, and it means a lot to pilots, and the general public is like, it's very confusing. And it was pointed out when we were going through this that, well, I want to fly out IFR. Well, sure, you can fly out IFR. You can file an IFR flight plan, and as long as you are in VMC, you can take off out of here and you can join up at, I don't know what it is, 4,100 feet or 4,300 feet. You can get on radar, and then your IFR flight plan gets opened, and you are now part of the FAA's aviation system, and they will make sure that you don't run into anything. Up to that point, you are on your own, as Marcus pointed out. So simply stated, the VMC rule just states that when you depart out of here, you have to have the FAA's requirement for visual meteorological conditions. You need to be able to use your eyeballs and see and avoid trees and hills which are surrounding the airport. And the FAA calls that obstacles and terrain. So that gets us to enforcement. So HOAs, and especially in the state of California, it's stated that the board of directors and the association have a fiduciary responsibility to enforce the governing documents. This includes the rules. And because our airport falls under an HOA, we rely on the Sonoma County Sheriff to enforce trespass. Our security staff can't go out there and make an arrest. We can't issue a citation to a non-member. We don't have a Denver boot anymore, so we can't Denver boot the airplane. So we are beholden to having the Sonoma County Sheriff get involved for trespass at the airport when the person is not authorized to operate at the airport. Also, we should not rely on members for reporting violations. However, members can. Members can document violations and turn them into security and act as the eyes and ears of our security team. However, that is not, I think, a viable long-term solution. So I think it's time for the association to mount motion activated and time interval cameras to document arrivals and departures in airplanes that are sitting on the ramp. Most airports have these now. They are just like de rigueur. That's what happens at airports. So I've heard that the board may consider removing the VMC rule. We have this rule because I know that we've got a few people that have just decided to make up their own procedure and do what they want. Given the variances in our airport permit from Caltrans and the challenging environment that our airport sits in, it struck several of us working on the airport rules that this behavior shouldn't be permitted at our airport. Now, can the board reverse the decision? Sure, absolutely. The board can do anything they want to with the rules. Should it? If I were on the board, I would argue against it. Directors and HOAs have a duty of care, also known as due diligence. And this duty requires that board members make informed decisions that are in the best interest of the association and to act with care and diligence. With what the board knows now, reversing this rule and an accident happens in poor visibility that impacts the association or, God forbid, a member on the ground, I would not want to have to sit in a deposition and answer questions about, did I act with a duty of care in reversing that decision that was made by a prior board? So this is a quote from the California Association, Homeowners Associations on Code of Ethics and Duty of Care. Quote, accordingly, the services provided by the board of directors require honesty, impartiality, fairness, and equity, and must be dedicated to the protection of the public health, safety, and welfare. So what's left? As Marcus pointed out, we started the process with the FAA to raise the traffic pattern altitude to 1,000 feet to comply with the FAA recommendations and what other airports do. Forms have been filled out with the FAA, and once processed, then this gets picked up by Caltrans to reissue our airport permit. The pilot briefing then will get updated to reflect this. This is an operational issue. This is not a policy issue. This falls under the purview of the community manager as the designated airport manager. Next, the board has two documents sitting in front of it. It has a user acknowledgement document and it has a use permit document. The user acknowledgement is greatly simplified, and a lot of this came from Mark McClone and input that was provided to the board. And we took Mark's input and gave it to our Davis Sterling attorney, who said, yeah, some of this is actually reasonable. And we came up with, I think, a much more streamlined document for members to use to sign off that they have a copy of the pilot briefing, that they've read the rules, they carry sufficient insurance as required by the association, and it registers the aircraft with the association so that security knows who's authorized to use the airport. And I made the comment earlier that we know more about the people who swim in the pools or play tennis than who actually use the airport. It's a simple document. It can be put online by the association. We've now got Salesforce. There's a number of things that are all being automated so that a user can go onto the website, fill it out, submit the document, and you're done. There is a heavyweight contract that was written by our aviation attorney for commercial operations. And I think with the weight limit that the board imposed in changing Rule 7.2, there are only 2 small commercial operators now that fly small aircraft into Sea Ranch for, we'll call it an air taxi service. I'm not sure that either one of them would sign that document. It's dense. They would have to have it reviewed by an attorney, and it would probably cost them a lot of money. My guess is they would say it's not worth it. So I'm not on the board anymore, and I have no idea what they will do with that document, whether they will actually, and I don't know what they will do with the user document or the user acknowledgement. They could pick them up and run with them, or they could drop them on the floor. With that, I'm done.
We have a handheld, and we also have over there for any questions that you may have.
Testing. Hi, Julie. Michael. Hi, my name is Michael Kent. I'm a commercial pilot. I fly a Cessna 182. I own hangar number 4. I own a piece of land right on the airstrip, midfield, lot 30C-0-5. I have a lot of vested interest in keeping this airport operating properly and in good shape. We all believe in safety. I was instrumental in opening the new Cuyama Airport, Lima 88. I did all the drawings for it, all the signage, all the markings. I worked hand in hand with the FAA and Caltrans Aero to get it reopened after 6 years of being defunct. The references that you're making towards the signage, there's a vast difference between having a private airport, which is, I happen to own a private airport. It's a ranch. It's a decomposed granite runway. It's not gravel. It doesn't have to be asphalt. It doesn't need to have signage and markers. The only markings that it needs, like our airport, which is a private use airport, is to have the threshold markings. That's it. The fact that we're trying to upgrade it are all very good and intelligent things to do. But let's make it really clear. These are not requirements. These are niceties. I don't believe that there was ever anything written up on our airport to close it unless these markings were not, unless this work was done or not done. Is that correct?
I'll answer.
Okay, yeah, so. So,
Do you want to go point by point?
no, well, I was just, that was kind of a direct question to Mark.
Because we can address that point. That one's
Yeah.
easy.
So
Okay.
it was a yes or no question.
So, well, it's not a yes or no question, so I'm going to give you a comprehensive answer. Our airport permit requires that we comply with airport design FAA document.
A private use airport does not require all FAA standards. Now, I understand that you come from a helicopter professional pilot. I also am a commercial pilot, and I understand that, Marcus. But to grandstand and say that this has to be, and this is the only way, is not true. I have spoken directly with our airport inspector, Robert Long, and he's aware of our situation here because I asked him, you were probably instrumental in wanting to arbitrarily raise our traffic pattern from 800 to 1,000. Completely wrong, because you just can't do that. It was a part of our permit, which I pointed out, and then you're now going through the proper process to try to get it raised. Should it be 1,000? You know what? There are thousands. There's 10,000 airports across this country that have non-standard. Oh, well, we're going to limit my time. I'm sorry.
Well,
That have non-standard.
no, I really want to answer your
but
questions.
the point is
know.
that, if you want an expert opinion, I am an expert in airports. I own an airport. I had to get this airport reopened. So when I hear statistics like the VMC, the dangers well, here, let me just a quick one, Marcus. Just, here, I just Googled, how dangerous is it for, no, it doesn't, but it will. Oh, no, I have absolutely no qualms about whether,
Okay, just a minute. Just to make sure that those who are online could hear the question from someone in the audience. She wanted to know whether or not his private airport that he owns has houses around it or underneath.
there is a
flight
house
path.
underneath the typical approach path. So their answer is yes on that aspect of it. But we don't have, we have a decent runway safety area. It's 240 feet wide. Our runway, or my runway, is almost 100 feet wide. It's a mile long. It's twice as long as this one. It's over twice as
Yeah.
wide. But
Just one question. How many people here in the audience have questions because that want to ask questions? So, and we have someone online as well. So please
I'll be very
be
quick.
concise about this
Okay.
because you're not the only person. Thank you.
Driving versus flying by the numbers, just, January 16, 2023, the overall fatality risk is 0.23 versus driving, which is 1 out of 101. You need to fly every day for more than 10,000 years, Marcus, to be in a fatal plane crash. That's general aviation. Okay, so let's not try to blow this up more than anything else that it is. And we have all listened to departure procedures regarding VMC and IMC. The bottom line simply is this: is that it's up to the pilot to make those answers. And believe it or not, after how many, what is it, $25,000 to get your private pilot's license now? We're not out to risk anything for anybody in any way. What we're trying to do is be safe and responsible. And I'm here just to put it out there from the pilot's point of view. I really wish we had another pilot or two on this panel to be able to give our 30-minute discussion and presentation. And I'd love to have a more detailed discussion with you, Marcus, and you, Scott, because from everything that I've heard, you've been the proponent and the instigator of the person trying to drive this user agreement, which is just, quite frankly, I think it's irresponsible. So that's my 2 bits.
I just want to point out that I'm no longer on the board, and I was one of 7 people on the board. So it wasn't, I drove the issue. There were 6 other people involved in the process. Do you want to take the
Yes.
airport?
Yeah, I'm gonna, yeah, Michael, you had a lot of questions and I want to do justice to them all. Every stat that I provided and every statistic and everything I said is reference-based, and I can provide those references. And let me talk. Don't interrupt me. I didn't interrupt you. And I'm trying to answer your questions, and it's going to take more than 1 sentence. As far as the traffic pattern altitude goes, why are we changing it from 800 to 1,000? We have had meetings with Robert Long of Caltrans. He recommended we amend the FAA 7480 form to correct that traffic pattern altitude. Caltrans wants us to do it. We are doing that, and then the airport permit will get rectified. The other thing is this airport, you're incorrect. It's a special use airport. And no,
Can you let him finish, please?
And there is also, let's get into accident. Well, you asked questions, so I'm trying to, I'm trying to answer. Actually, Michael, if you look, well, you're walking out, I'm sorry. But if you actually look in the airport permit, it stipulates we have to comply with an FAA document on airport design, the one that's 434 pages long. And a lot of what we have done is in compliance with that. And some of it's recommended, not all of it's required. Some of it's recommended. Also, what I would say is that you can't lump general aviation with the airlines and commercial aviation because they have incredibly safe records. You really need to separate it. They're apples and oranges. And there was a study at Embry-Riddle University that found the accident rate is higher for IFR pilots than VFR pilots in general aviation. It's the opposite of commercial. IFR is way safer. It's a great way to fly. But when they did a study on general aviation, they found the opposite to be true. And like I said, maybe Linda can post my email.
Sure.
Everything I've got is reference-based.
Okay, yes, and we can put that on the Sea Ranch Forums website. I would like to ask Diane Hichwa, who's online, who wanted to ask a question, to go there. So Diane, can
Great.
you speak?
Sure. I'm not a pilot. I'm a homeowner and a full-time resident, and I'm about 2 blocks from the airport. So I have 2 parts to the question. Does the current VMC liability rule that requires pilots to have at least a mile visibility go far enough for safety? And also, do we have adequate fire and medical help available to deal with an actual incident here?
I think when people rebel against the 1 mile visibility that Sea Ranch now requires pilots have to land and take off, you could make a very good argument for an aircraft wanting to enter the IFR system for a much higher minimum. We see at Little River Airport and other airports around that actually do have instrument departure procedures. The minimums for those departure procedures are actually higher than our airport, and we don't even have an instrument approach procedure. So, I mean, departure procedure, excuse me. So that is more pertinent discussion to have than removing the VMC rule of 1 mile. You know, that's it. I think you raise a valid point, and that should actually be considered.
Okay.
Getting to Diane's second question, I actually talked with Bonnie Plakos about this, and Bonnie's response was pragmatic as would be expected. You know, we talked about a large like a PC-12 if it had a large number of people on it and an accident and a large number of injuries. And, she said we would do the same thing we had if there was a head-on collision of two cars on Highway 1 and both cars were filled with people, right? I mean, luckily we've got CAL FIRE that's right across the street. But it's a point, but I think that limiting the airport operations based off the fact that, I don't know, there's not 8 ambulances available to us. I don't think that's a direction to go down.
And I wasn't necessarily expecting that we would limit it, but do we need to cover ourselves and any liability? Do we need to add services?
Well, I'm not sure about services, and I'm not sure what the association would do.
I want to say, I see Bonnie Plakos online and she unmuted herself.
Oh.
Bonnie, did you want to add in anything?
Sure. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Yeah, no, I just, Scott was accurate in his report. But the point is, I mean, we don't have the kind of specialized airport response equipment they might have at a big commercial airport for big passenger jets. But responding, to an aircraft crash, it would be awful, and it would be just like responding to an overturned propane tank, truck on Highway 1. And if it caught fire, that would be bad, but it would be a hazardous material incident. We know how to do that. If it set the vegetation on fire, that's a vegetation fire. We know how to handle that. So I hope it never happens, but we do have sufficient initial response.
Great, thank you.
I would just add that airports that have scheduled airlines and those types of commercial operations, such as Santa Rosa, they're required by law to have their own fire departments at the airport. And I've met those folks, and there's times I've landed my aircraft and I would go meet them and hang out and talk to them. And they have specialized equipment and specialized training just for aircraft accidents, which can be a little bit unique. You're dealing with different types of fuels and, the hazmat, and the situations are different. And so they actually do, you go to a commercial airport like that, and they will have specialized firefighting equipment and personnel.
Yeah, and to point out,
Not saying we need that here. I'm just pointing that out.
and to put a box around it, by the board limiting the size of aircraft that can land here to 8,500 pounds. I mean, we're going to have a couple of PC-12s that are coming in. I don't know whether that's 2 or 3, but in limiting the size of the aircraft, you've limited just the volume of fuel that can be on board should, a catastrophe like that happen. But I have full faith in our firefighting personnel on the coast to handle anything that would happen.
So Diane, do you feel your question is answered?
I think that.
Okay,
I think
I will. She's muted now. Good. Okay, next person, come on up here. Next person on the Price is Right. Come on down.
Just come on down. Got to get right.
Thank you all for your time. The question I have is, I'm Wayne Colburn. I'm a pilot, own hangar number 1, Marcus. With regards to the advisory circular on airport and airport design, it's like we're in compliance with some of it, but we built homes that are not in compliance with that. And so the thing with the FAA is, if it's in print, is like, advisory is advisory. Unless it's in the regs, then it's a regulation. And for me, if it's in print, it's in print. And that, like I said, with legal opinions, if that's not in the rules and the regs, if there's a legal opinion, you better conform to it. So I guess the question is, how did we come to build homes that because they're not in compliance with that 400-page advisory circular? So it's just a question.
Thank you, Wayne. Yeah, I think I can't speak to that, but I can speak that the reason why we're legal with it is because we did get a variance to that effect. We got 6 variances in the permit. So that allows us to legally operate the way we are operating.
Say it was to a large extent economic, that they needed to sell more lots.
No, yeah, thank you. You did a good job on the history. I do know someone from Redwood Aviation when they owned the Piper dealership, and in a short
The
period,
rodeos,
in a short period of time, they were like, these pilots have planes, they have money, we should sell to them too. And so Castle and Cook put a party on, and they got involved with the Piper dealership, and so you're right, it comes down to economics. How can we sell more property? And that's probably what it was. I just don't know how long the homes have been
I
there.
do think there was a sort of, not so much like that the airstrip was kind of artistic in a sense, like it was, something that wasn't as actively used. It was like, to be sort of a, recreational,
Mhm.
uh, facility going forward. And I think there probably was less thought given to, oh, this is, how to be really technically correct. How do we look at this as an active, airport
Right.
with a lot of planes flying in and
I
out?
did, I did see a historical document with crossing runways and an FBO and the lights and the fuel and all that, which never came about, but yeah.
But
Okay.
there are a lot of things that were promised that did
Yeah,
not come about.
Yeah, like the playgrounds for the kid, well, and subdivisions and so forth that happen.
Okay.
I wanted to can I just jump in really quick? So the gentleman who came up and chastised us for wanting to bring the airport into compliance with the FAA advisory circular, I, I take a bit of umbrage with that. I mean, it's stated in our airport permit, the number one, it's not number 10, it's number 1. It says the airport is to be maintained in accordance with the FAA Advisory Circular 155, blah, 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 blah numbers, right? And that document specifies how the airport should be marked. And we were not in compliance with it. And, and that's where Marcus and I got involved. And some of these things are safety issues. Why would you argue with a safety issue, right? It's like we're putting yellow lines down, it's a couple $100 for some yellow paint on the ground, but it's a safety issue. It's to make sure that a plane does not go onto the runway environment. They know where to hold if there's another airplane operating. I have no idea why somebody would want to argue over a safety issue when, oh, well, we're a private airport, we can do whatever we want. It boggles my mind.
Okay. Thank you. Next.
Hi, is it on? Yeah. My name's Dana Fridiani. I live somewhat close to the airport. And over the years, I've been here since 2015 to now. And every once in a while, I hear a plane take off at night.
Yep.
There's no doubt about it. And that's against the rules.
Middle of the night, right?
Middle of the night.
Middle of the night, airplane
Wakes me
leaves.
up. I'm very clear what it is. And I was very surprised, like you said, we're going to put, I guess, cameras or whatever. I'm surprised we don't have it because it sounds like there's no, it's a free for all. They can take off. Nobody can really pinpoint them. So my thing is, or my question, or my hope is we do have cameras at the airport, because I have not witnessed an accident that missed clearing the hill. It hit the hill, but I saw the accident after, and the horrific things that I saw from that plane crash, and parts of bodies and so forth. It's amazing what can happen. And if taken off at nighttime like this, and they can't really see, right? Is that my understanding? You're in the dark.
Well, as somebody who's taken off in an airplane on a runway where I turned the runway lights off, you've got a headlight on the plane, right? I mean, you can do it.
Yeah,
But
it's dangerous.
but
Yeah,
should you? And the answer is no.
that's my main concern. I mean, I know we have daytime issues and stuff like that, but that's my main concern. So if I ever hear of a plane crashing at nighttime, it's not going to be pretty. For all the pilots.
I would say that in the last 2 months, I've gotten 3 contacts from people that live around the airport that said they heard an airplane take off at night from Sea Ranch. There's no video, there's no pictures. And then when I went to tracking data, I didn't see any aircraft. So, we've got a Sea Ranch member that does a pretty good job tracking aircraft. It's a good database. I think a lot of you have seen it. The only problem with that is that it requires the aircraft have ADS-B equipment installed. And according to the FAA, like a little more than 39% of the general aviation aircraft do not have it installed. And we don't know here who does and who doesn't. So it's possible that an aircraft could be flying and it's not going to show up on the tracking data. It's required for some airspaces and some airports, but it's not required for our airspace. So we really don't know. Maybe every airplane that comes in here has it, and maybe using the FAA data, 39% don't. We don't know. And it costs a lot of money. It's at minimum $2,000. It can be up to $11,000 depending on what's already installed on the airplane to have that specific equipment. So I tried to follow up to see if really aircraft were departing at night, and I could not find anything.
But if we had motion activated cameras like there's critter cams,
Well, that's
to see
100%.
bears,
Yeah.
we could probably see it. Ronnie?
Hi, I'm Ronnie Sharp. And to follow up on that, I've been told by pilots, quite a few pilots, that the non-TSRA flight tracking system is 100% accurate. And I wanted to know how true that was. And I also wanted to know, we've had rules, we haven't implemented rules. Now we have some new rules. I just wanted to know, why do we need rules we haven't had in the past?
Okay, I'll answer the first one first. That is the tracking system. I think it's an admirable effort. I mean, it's good information to have, and the person that's running it has been very responsive. Like when I sent him an email asking him, hey, did you have an aircraft? I've got a report from somebody about an aircraft departing at this time. Very forthright with it. But that system depends on that aircraft having ADS-B. It's an acronym, I apologize for it. It's better than me saying all the words. But ADS-B equipment installed on that aircraft, and 38%, not 39, but 38% of the aircraft, according to the FAA, don't have it. So that's why it's not capturing 100. Nobody can say it's 100%. It's impossible because nobody knows all the aircraft that come into Sea Ranch. No one's checked all those aircraft to see if they have the equipment. And this has been brought up to me, well, can't a pilot just turn off the ADS-B equipment and go stealth mode, right? Well, I don't believe a pilot would do that. Number one, it's illegal. They're regulatory prohibited from doing that. So I don't think that's happening. If an aircraft isn't being tracked, I would suspect it's just the aircraft simply doesn't have the equipment on board.
And if they're violating rules,
What
they
was
are
your
motivated to
second
get.
You had 2 questions.
Why are we changing the rules?
Oh, why are we changing the rules when we don't have, well,
Well, when I look at the history,
yeah, you look at the history.
we went from really strict to maybe less strict. And like at one time, there was a rule, like the whole VMC question, right? Of, do you need a mile to depart? The new rule that the board just passed. Well, if you read old documents from the 70s, this was a VFR only airport and they said it. Somewhere along the line, that got dropped. So it seems like there's been some ebb and flow to it, but I feel like I don't feel like the rules are requiring 1 mile visibility to depart or land doesn't seem overly restrictive to me, and you get a lot of safety for your buck.
And getting to what was stated as VFR, that does get to the question that several pilots brought up to me. And it's like, well, if it states VFR, then I can't, by the rules of the association, leave on an IFR flight plan, right? That's what the worry was. And so that perhaps is why it got changed, but then nobody thought about, and you know, typically, I don't know, with these rule things, it's like, how do you address all the eventualities? And, you know, and some, God only knows, right? And so as, you know, as we were going through this, and I found out that people were leaving in, you know, cloud tops at tree height and, you know, visibility that was below VMC. And, you know, the gears started going off in my head about what does that mean for the association and the membership, right? And you know, does the association have a part to play in that? And coming up with what I think are a reasonable set of rules for operating out of the airport. And I had a very good friend of mine he has an ATP rating. He flies King Airs. He flew in a small plane here and came out, spent the day. We went hiking. I brought him up, and he and his family up to the airport. And it was one of those days, the fog just went boop. And he goes, I'm spending the night because I am not leaving here in IMC. He just didn't feel good about doing it.
One thing, just.
Sure.
again,
And then we're going to go to Stephen Kilgore online.
I think if you look at also the historical context and how many people were using the airstrip and also really writing the rules and the conduct, I think as it grows and as the population grows and the usage grows, it's in part not wanting, just like any other set of regulations, less individual decisions about whether something is a good thing to do or an okay thing to do, and more oversight, if you will, and definitions about what is right. So at the sort of regulatory level versus the individual level, I think you saw that change over time.
Okay, Steve, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
There, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good, thank you. Yeah, I'm Steve Kilgore, and I'm the member that Marcus was referring to regarding collecting the ADS-B data. So I just had a couple of comments I wanted to mention and clear up some information here. I think Marcus is correct about 38% of the planes in the United States do not have ADS-B. I read numbers similar to that. But in California, I believe it's different. I think it's a very, very small percentage. I don't think there's too many areas in California you could fly a plane very far where it wouldn't be required. I think Alaska, for example, and maybe some parts of the Midwest are predominantly planes that don't have ADS-B, but in California, it's different. So I think in California, it's unlikely we're going to come across many planes that don't have that capability. And then regarding the other lady's comment about airplanes landing or taking off at night, I've looked over my data very carefully for many weeks or actually months worth of data in certain periods when I was told that there might be nighttime activity and I didn't see any. And I also want to mention that if somebody was doing that and they had ADS-B, like Marcus said, and they disabled it, that would be illegal. But it's unlikely that someone would be taking off here without it, and then they'd also have to have arrived without it, or they were arrived later, or arrived earlier rather, without it. If they don't match up, in other words, if somebody was to come here one day and then leave at night, I would see that in my data because my program checks to make sure that whenever somebody arrived, they also left. If somebody left, they were here at some time and I saw that. So my program alerts me when there's an inconsistency there. So I really don't think the likelihood that somebody is actually taking off or landing at night is, very high. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
I appreciate that, Steve. I would just add to that, as far as California goes, if you look at California's airspace from South Bay, San Jose, all the way north to Oregon, only 2% of that area has airspace that requires ADS-B. So you don't know, we just don't know how many aircraft. It's not required here. It's only required if you're going in the Bay Area or Sacramento. I mean,
Right.
so, and that's not much airspace area when you count all of Northern California. It's just an unknown. And
Yeah, no,
so
I
as long
understand
as
that.
it's an unknown, we just can't say it's 100%.
Yeah, no, and I
My
don't
only
think,
point.
I'm certainly not saying it's 100%. But I think realistically, what would somebody be doing flying into Sea Ranch if they didn't have a home here? And they probably would be coming from an affluent area such as the Bay Area, so they would have ADS-B. I think it's really unlikely that there's a very, a crop duster type airplane or something like that flying north of here that just wants to fly in and fly out for the heck of it. I mean, there must be a reason someone would arrive here, and I can't think of any that would.
Well, we have a lot of pilots here, Grass Valley, Auburn, and then Santa Rosa. So we do have a lot of non-Bay Area pilots that fly in and out of here and fly from other places. So we just don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that
But
doesn't.
I
prove that
really
you fly in
appreciate your
here.
efforts, though. I mean, I've emailed you enough. You've been very helpful, and I think that information is valuable. So that's great.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah,
Is there
thank you.
anyone else here that wants to ask a question? Oh, okay. One of you come up.
I had one question and then I guess a couple comments. The allegation that someone has made a nighttime departure is a shocking one, and I had just first heard that today.
From a number of people.
And so I think that'll be interesting. In the pilot community, I don't think anybody would do that. You can't see anything. It would be really dumb. So I hope nobody has done that or will do that. My other comment, we have a relatively quiet airport, less than one flight per day. And so I found, concerns about, it being intolerably noisy to be surprising, given how quiet our airport is. It was busier during COVID. 2-3 times as many folks were here. We saw a lot more kids on the beaches, a lot more people on the beaches. The parking lots were fuller, and the airport was busier. And that is decreasing now. I guess the only question I had in regards to signage, one of the biggest concerns I've had about safety at the airport has been pedestrians and cars on the runway. And I've had to run off folks 3 times now from one end or the other of the runway, 1 car and 2 sets of pedestrians. The pedestrians were striking a pose, something like this, the selfie, the runway behind them.
Great.
And one person drove an SUV onto the runway. So one of the signs I would love to see at the 2 entrances to the runway would be something that says, no trespassing, no pedestrians, no vehicles. And as you enter 30, there's no signage along those lines. And I certainly applaud having FAA compliant signage, but normal layperson signage that says, this is a runway, don't go here.
You are in grave danger.
Yeah, and I know there's some on the sides of the runway that says, don't walk here, like for dog walkers and whatnot. But people come into the parking area and they park their car and they get out and they want to take a selfie with a runway in the background. It's ridiculous. So
Sorry. I have a picture here of. With all the deer. And it says keep off runway and cleared area bordering runway.
Yeah, the
What
problem
is-
is they walk on from over there.
Right, that's
Where
another,
there's
that's
no-
another sign over here.
But there's
I didn't
no-
get that.
Yeah, there's no sign on the roadway
And
entering the runway.
What was your, I'm
So
sorry, what was
I'm
your
all-
name?
I'm all for,
Dane, okay. You-
I'm all for more signs if necessary.
I think that's good. Let's look into that. Also, I would tell everybody, pilot or non-pilot, if you see something that could be better at the airport or something that you have a concern about, call the association and report it. Evan Dilks, he's our safety security guy. So you may see something nobody else sees that deserves attention.
Can I make a comment real quick about nighttime operations? I am a sea rancher. I live in Wallala though. I own property here. So I'm not here near the airport, but my second home is my father-in-law's house at the airport. And it is very, very, very close. I am a terrible, I can't throw worth a darn, but I could hit any aircraft that was taking off from the kitchen door of my father-in-law's house. And I can tell you when you're inside, especially if you're doing something else, you're not really paying attention exactly what's going on outside. If you hear an ATV or a dirt bike, it sounds like it's a Cessna coming in from far away. We often stand there and go, is that an aircraft or is that someone on a dirt bike? Especially because they do trespass onto our property. So it's possible, and I know it sounds silly and you want to laugh at it, but if you're inside a building, you can't necessarily tell the difference. And I wouldn't be surprised if people hearing that kind of thing, especially in the middle of the night, if they're woken up by it, it could be something else. It may not be aircraft. It is hard to tell. When I'm awake as well, sometimes I have to go stand outside and really listen and see where that sound is moving. And admittedly, we're on Old Stage Road. And so these kids buzz up and down on their dirt bikes and things and on our property. And so you have to kind of hear where it's going. But it occurs to me that some people may be falsely reporting things happening at night because they hear something else.
Hi, Winston Vickers. I'm a resident here in Sea Ranch. On the statistics, you were giving percentages of this type of takeoff or whatever that had been fatal or non-fatal. I just wanted to put out there these statistics about the relative safety of general aviation. The impression was that general aviation was pretty unsafe that I was getting because you're comparing to commercial and so forth. But the actual statistics are that fatal accidents per 100,000 flight hours in general aviation is 0.77. So 0 points, less than one fatal accident per 100,000 hours, and 4.28 accidents, period. So if we look at the amount of traffic here in our airport of flights in and out, one per day on average, or just somewhat less than one per day, that probably amounts to less than half an hour or so of an aircraft within the vicinity of the airport for each of those operations. And so even if it were an hour, that's 365 hours of flight time in the vicinity of the airport per year. And at 100,000 hours per year to get less than 5 accidents, we have a very, very low accident probability. So certainly they can happen. Certainly all the concerns are appropriate. I'm a pilot, instrument and commercial. And I can say pilots are the most careful people that I've ever run into. They have to be. Their lives are at risk and their passengers' lives. And I feel that a lot of the conversations have been a little disingenuous in that they've so overemphasized the risk of an actual accident relative to what it actually is based on FAA statistics. Also, second thing, quickly, The rules to reduce some of the weight limits may reduce, and seemingly to reduce air taxi potential, almost intentionally trying to reduce it. There are a lot of people here that kind of have to use air taxis for medical reasons to go get their cancer chemotherapy or whatever. I think being too restrictive tends to discriminate against some of the people with medical problems in our community.
Okay, we are past the 5 o'clock for the regular thing. So is there anyone else who has a question? Oh, Ronnie wants one more comment.
Sorry, I keep hearing about one plane per day, and it's not a typically like a one plane per day situation, although sometimes it is. It's a lot of traffic on the weekends, a lot of traffic during holidays. There was a comment at one time where they said, oh, they only heard helicopters once, maybe a month, when 2 took off that morning. So it happens more often than you think.
Is there anyone else online that wants to? Okay.
I'm Mark McClone. We got a relatively small audience here, but I want to impress upon each of you. I want to second what Winston said. Pilots, they're generally your good neighbors. They're not irresponsible, uncaring people. They are generally responsible. If any of us pilots heard about a flight at night, we'd be the first ones on it. I'm sorry you're shaking your head, but we do not condone that. Pilots are not. And I'm saying, if we heard about it, we would be totally after that pilot. Okay, and I want to thank on those assembled for putting on the presentation, and Linda for putting it together. I did offer to join the board. I'm a 3,500 hour turboprop pilot, instrument rated, lots of time in small airports. We don't have a pilot on the board. When you brought the concerns, and I credit you both. Oh, okay. We don't have a current Sea Ranch pilot on the board. And there are a dozen, and at least a couple of those, they are at the pinnacle of the aviation industry. There's one guy, he's one of 10 or 20 in the world at his level of instructor capability and recognition. We have been trying, I know I've made the effort, since airport concerns were brought up, to have a cross-table discussion. You need to, this is about airports. We need to involve the current users as well as neighbors' concerns. And I beg you, let's try and do it in a more kind of consensus fashion instead of putting the pilots in a defensive position. Let's talk, let's get together and have a more open discussion. That's my request. Thank you. Julie, thank you and your family.
Thanks. When I was putting this panel together, I wanted the issues to be on the history of airports and of safety and of rules. I didn't feel that recreational use of airports was as important as safety rules.
Well, I just wanted to say that I have flown locally here. So I flew for 39 years, and I did fly into Sea Ranch. I flew for CalStar. So I flew in air ambulance for 19 years, and I flew into RCMS, Mendocino,
Who's talking?
Sea Ranch, and a whole bunch of highways in between that you can imagine, day and night. So I feel like I've got some local knowledge here, and my credentials should speak for themselves.
I don't know who that was.
So, okay. Right now, I'm going to thank everyone for coming. And there's a couple things. One, I want to say the next scheduled forum is Saturday, October 5th, and that will have the top 2 candidates for the 2nd California Assembly District. And we're going to have a debate. We had all 6 candidates back in February, and now we're having the top 2. So if you have any questions that you want, please send them ahead to the Sea Ranch Forum at gmail.com. And there's another tradition for Sea Ranch Forum, is that we take the chairs and we put them away to make it easier for our facilities crew. So this is recorded and it will be available on YouTube in a couple days, and I'll send out another email about that. Thank you very much for coming.